And we are live. Congratulations, you made it through the week. Another amazing week of food safety, food quality, all those products out in the marketplace, all the yummy stuff that we all know and love and trust. And a lot of times in what we do in food safety and quality assurance, it goes unnoticed. But Duncan and I are here today to say thank you. We appreciate everything that you do to make those foods what they are. If you're new to the chat, welcome. Pull up a chair. This is the Food Safety Chat Live, and every Friday at 8 a.m. Mountain Time, some other random time in England, we live stream here, and we bring you all 3 o'clock. Nice. And so we bring you a conversation around food safety, and that's what you'll notice about this too, is that this is not a presentation where it's a one-sided flow of information. This has evolved into, and I'm very proud of this, into a conversation online. And we have a core group of people who join us every week and share their knowledge and expertise, one of which is Duncan. And so every now and then, the guests on the chat are actual participants in the chat as well. And this is how we got to know each other, which is amazing. So Duncan Lacey, of course, is with the Food Industry Hub. How are you doing today, sir?
No, really good. And we did talk about the idea of changing the format so it would just be Bryan speaking and I would listen, but sticking to the traditional chat format, which I think we made the right decision.
Yeah, just listening to me, that'd be pretty boring. I think after a while I'd probably start dancing or doing something. But nobody's gonna like that. So as people are starting to file in here, so Bahana, welcome. Megan, nice to see Megan as well. Elena. So I got to meet Elena in person on Monday. So I did a presentation. I met with Patty McNamara's group and Alera Technologies. They had a little conference here in Denver, and I spoke on risk assessment with that group. And that's what's kind of cool about LinkedIn. So Duncan and I were chatting before we went live here, is this format is really evolving and growing, and it's no longer just a place for your resume. It's really a place where you can build these type of relationships in the professions that we specialize in, which is great. We get to make these relationships. And with Elena, I'm sure she feels the same too. By the time we actually met in person, it felt like we already knew each other, which was really cool. And LinkedIn user in Florida, I'm betting that's Jose. So hopefully that's Jose. Ryan, good to see you.
User. Good to see you.
So how's the weather over there, Duncan?
Oh, actually really sunny. So I've instead of going for an artificial background, I've just put things on blur this time, and you can see the sun streaming in behind me. So no, very nice.
Very nice. Yeah, it's a nice, pleasant fall here in Colorado. It's currently 55 degrees Fahrenheit. I always get the conversion a little goofy on these numbers. So it's around 12 and a half, 13 degrees. So not too bad. I think it's going to be, that's the current temperature. I think it's going to be probably, it might even reach, I don't think it's going to be as warm as 20, but it's going to be a very nice day here for sure. So one of the things that we do here on the chat, guys, as we get started is join Duncan and I for a drink of your favorite beverage. And we'll do the English. That's not tea. You're English. Come on. You're supposed to have tea. What is this?
It can be tea next time.
Cheers, everyone. Very nice. Yep. Yeah, Elena's right. Yeah, the Denver Food Safety Night was a ton of fun. One of the more interesting people that I met there was a gentleman who works with the insurance industry. So when there are major recalls, he represents the insurance recall companies, and he goes in and evaluates their programs to see if they're worthy of reinstatement on the recall policies, or if the initial claim itself is valid. So if the company was negligent and didn't do a good job, they may, deny that claim associated with a recall. So it was very fascinating talking with him and that application of food safety and what he does. I can only imagine a role like that. You're on call 24/7, I would guess, right? So if there's an issue or a crisis, man, you're on a plane. So
I just assumed that Elena was going to be the most interesting person you met at the event.
Well, that is true. That is true. Hi, Cheryl. Good to see you. So, Duncan, are you ready? Are you ready for the dad joke? So I don't know about over in the UK, but here in the US, there's been a lot of pressure for whatever reason around the price of meat. And I've read different things in the industry news sites about kind of, it's a combination of lack of animals available for meat and things like this, and the high demand in the marketplace. So the price of meat has absolutely skyrocketed here in the U.S. And I was looking for just something that was a little more reasonable, because I was thinking, Duncan, I'm not even going to be able to afford meat any longer. But there is good news. There's one type of meat that I found that was still the same price, and that meat was deer meat. Very surprising, because it was still only $1.
I don't know if you should be allowed to keep on doing this.
I have received cease and desist letters, several from law firms. So
just on the stupid joke part of this, so listening to Rory Sutherland before we came on to the call, he says, "Why did the chicken cross the road?"
What was that?
Why did the chicken cross the road?
Why did the chicken cross the road, Duncan?
Stupid and misleading question, because it assumes that there's only one chicken and there's only one reason.
Leading
and
the
I know
witness.
that you've not introduced the topic so far, but I just thought I'd throw that out at the appropriate point.
There you go. So we'll dive into our topic here. We have a ton. We were like, man, we're gonna have to talk pretty fast here in our conversation. Oh my God. So with that, with the Food Industry Hub, huge presence on LinkedIn and on your website, and I'll put a link here at the end as well. You've been up to a ton. So what have been some of the things that you've been up to in your business, Duncan?
So it's really scaled out, and originally Food Industry Hub launched a software service for food manufacturers, and the core features are things like document control, the quality manual, incidents, non-conformance handling with root cause analysis, with associated trending, raw material risk assessment, and supplier management. There's a bunch of other features, but those are the core grouping. And surrounding that, Food Industry Hub as a kind of entity presence has got a huge range of free resources and informational content. It started off as the blog, then expanded to include the knowledge center. There's the resources signposting service, which has got direct links to every major food information resource you've never heard of. Recently, we've introduced a free raw material specification template that anybody can download and use, and that's for managing your supply chain risks. So it's really scaled out. More recently, I've been working on a couple of top secret projects, which I can't announce publicly until I'm ready to go live, but there will be a bit of a segue into some of the underlying work approach later in the conversation as we talk a little bit about AI.
Nice. Yeah. So that's a little bit of a teaser there, right? So part of our conversation, and it's part of the mechanics of how the chat works behind the scenes, is we do a prep call earlier in the week, and our prep call was an hour long, and we could have kept going easily with that. So part of this is, kind of narrowing in the focus, and it kind of really culminated in a thought process for me around it. It was a good illustration of the thought process that we need to go through in quality in order to reach the deliverables that we're looking for. Because one of the rules in life is you can't do everything. You have to be selective. You have to decide, right? So it's like that old saying relative to, to decide, going back to the root in Latin, is to cut off, meaning that you can't do everything. What you decide to do also means there's things that you decide not to do. And that decision-making process for a quality manager in a plant is paramount, isn't it?
100% love that. And it makes you think about the way the word incision is related to the word decision.
Yeah, very true. Right. So if you are frozen and you do nothing, or you do a bunch of things all at the same time, I used to tell my managers, I would say, I would much rather have you do 5 things and execute against those 5 things well versus 10 things that are incomplete, because nobody wants that. So if you have too many things on your plate, I need to know that, and then we need to decide what things we need to take off and where those need to be moved. Because one of the character traits, it's, I almost want to say flaw, but not really. One of those character traits that we have in what we do, Duncan, is that we're willing to take on those burdens within companies. If someone in operations comes to us in the plant and says, "Oh man, we got this big problem here and we can't quite figure it out. We keep having failures in this particular area," the quality manager is always very quick to jump up, and she'll go out there and help, and very willing to roll up those sleeves. And sometimes that's to our own detriment, because then the things that we need to get done don't get done.
Well, there's an underlying willingness, which I think is part of kind of industry-wide conditioning, that you kind of never say no. And I think if you look at resource allocation into quality and technical relative to other departments or functions, your resource that you have with technical and quality never changes. So whatever it was at the beginning of the year, well, that is what it is at the end of the year. Whereas if you look at other departments, if some sort of new requirement is introduced, then discussions around, well, what resource allocation needs to accompany this are much more forthcoming. But alongside that, I think if you ever introduce a new priority, implicit with that is something else got deprioritized.
Yeah.
Because if you're looking at 100% of your resource availability, and that's not just money, but it's also time and focus. Every time you if you put something new in, the available pie chart doesn't become larger. It's simply that, bits start falling off. Intentionally or unintentionally. So if you intentionally deprioritize something to make way for the new commitment, then you're managing. But if you just continually add new and new, more and more requirements that you're saying yes to, but you're not intentionally deprioritizing other things, you're sort of sleepwalking your way into allowing things to degrade.
Yeah, and you don't even realize it because those things take place. And it's one of the things with working in quality, especially in a manufacturing environment, you have to be very aware of. Because to your point, Duncan, which was very well said, even if I'm an absolute workaholic and I'm in that plant 80 to 100 hours a week, just absolutely 7 days a week, just being absolute crazy, that's still a limitation, and you're going to burn yourself out. Part of what we do, and part of the reason why people attend this chat and invest their time in doing this, is we need to be forward thinking in what we do in food safety and quality assurance. We have to be thinking ahead of the curve. If the quality manager is spending their time firefighting and running around the plant and thinking they're doing stuff, eventually, to your point, the wheels are going to fall off. And I expect my quality managers to spend part of their time thinking. And that's the only way the plant gets better. And really, that was one of our first areas of conversation relative to this, is because we need to do most quality managers spend all on their time on corrective actions when they should be spending their time on preventive actions and figuring out how do we keep things from happening, which is part of the irony of what we do. Is if we're really good at preventive actions, nobody notices because those things never happen. It's easier to be the hero on the corrective action side than it is the preventer, isn't it?
Well, 100%. And I think we sort of, to a certain degree, glorify preventative and demonize corrective or responsive. And I buy into that to a certain extent, because if you can proactively prevent bad things or unintended things from arising, then it's sort of a stitch in time saves 9, but it probably doesn't just save 9. It probably saves more like 100, because if you can avoid one bad thing from happening, you just by extension, you've probably avoided a multiple of similar things from occurring. So you really do get that extrapolated benefit. But if you take the alternative point of view and say, well, is all responsive action inherently worse than preventative action? I'm going to say, well, no, it can't possibly be, because if you think about, you've just carried out a root cause analysis on some sort of an incident that arises. You can say categorically, whatever I'm about to implement as a corrective action, it's perfectly targeted to an identified existing weakness in the quality system.
Yeah.
Or at least it should be if you carried out your root cause analysis effectively. So if you compare and contrast preventative to responsive, preventative is speculative in nature, or to a certain extent, but it's largely preferable to compared to allowing bad things to happen in the first place, right?
Yeah.
But that comparison should at least take into account the fact that when you introduce corrective actions based in a responsive basis, they're much better and more practically targeted just in principle. So you've got some sort of an efficiency advantage when you do that.
Yeah. Well, and that's a good point. I want to reemphasize what you had said in there as well, which is corrective actions are a vital and important part of the process. You're never going to get rid of them, right? Things are going to happen. These two things work together. And unfortunately, and this gets back to this thinking piece of it, is we have kind of this toolkit, and you and I were kind of kicking this around earlier this week, of standard tools that we use for evaluation within this process. So a complaint comes in, consumers unhappy about something, and the retailer wants a response back and a corrective action follow-up associated with that. And some of those tools that we're familiar with, Duncan, of course, the Five Whys and the Fishbone diagram and things like this. And more often than not, number one, and this is an interesting aspect that ties into what we were just talking about, is a time limitation. So the retailer says, I expect an answer back from you in 3 days. And you're like, ugh, right? And so you try and get people together to do this, and you kind of go through the motions to get to a conclusion. But a lot of times, human nature, we've reached a conclusion already, and we're using the tools to justify the decision.
Yeah, so I think time and resource constraint always works against you. And it's funny saying that out loud, because time and resource constraint is actually an enabler for innovation in a lot of cases. So if you're looking at some sort of new innovative approach or new innovative technology or new innovative go-to-market strategy, you actually want to impose constraints in order to facilitate a more innovative process. But quality assurance is not inherently innovative in nature. So you've got all of the disadvantages working against you, but none of the advantageous output. And at the same time as saying that, we discussed on our prep call that I think there's a number of flaws that have kind of crept their way into the conventional way of approaching root cause analysis. That I think we've basically come a bit blind or conditioned to. So just over time, you end up in a position where your output from root cause analysis and the type of corrective and preventative actions that come from that end up a bit lackluster. And I'm very conscious of the fact that on other chats, you've kind of numerous occasions said that, well, we'll retrain the operators comes up a lot, and it's a little bit rote. So, yeah, there's a lot of criticisms that you could make to the entire process.
Yeah, and so for everybody's reference there, this is something I rail against quite a bit, is as someone on the receiving end of the investigations, one of the clear red flags that no work was done is the response comes back, retrain operator. That tells me that absolutely nothing was done on their side to prevent that issue, and it's probably going to recur again. And a lot of times I would reject those as well. Part of this as well too, and I think a lot of quality managers get caught up in this too, Duncan, is the feeling that every problem has to go through this mechanism. That's not necessarily the case. You need to look for trends. You can't investigate every single type of complaint, for example. One of the things that we had in past companies that I worked at, which was a great tool, was what we would call the quality alert. So I worked at large companies with large volumes of product going into the marketplace. And of course, consumers are giving you feedback, which is great. You want that. And what we would look for in the quality operation side of the business is trends. So if we had 3 complaints of the same category for the same product, the same plant, the same line, then that would trigger the quality alert, and the regional quality group would then get involved with the investigation at the plant to get on top of that right away. And those were then designed to be more rigorous versus the more ad hoc type activities that may be taking in the plant for one-off type things. So a load shows up from a supplier with damage, and you would issue a complaint back to the supplier type things. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. But paradoxically, that means that you could have a trend emerge as a result of numerous instances of fairly trivial, unwanted occurrences.
Yeah.
And as a result of the trend, it triggers a disproportionate response compared to one or two isolated occasions where you get something much more significant that doesn't get that same level of scrutiny. So,
Yeah.
kind of think you've always got to be quite balanced about the way you implement these things.
Oh, absolutely. No, that's a good point. You can't be too mechanistic in your reproach. So really, within those two examples, I think that's a good juxtaposition, is that the first example is a mechanism in place for dealing with corrective action. What you're describing is, well, there may be other things that are going on out there that we need to be aware of, which may be something that you want to jump on from a preventive standpoint as well. So let's say, for example, that a retailer is doing a shoddy job of maintaining their walk-in coolers or things like this, and a variety of different products are being compromised because of this. So you're seeing a bunch of little complaints for quality issues and compromised shelf life, but the standard, that's linked to that, the common cause, is that improper handling at the retail side that you would have to track down. Yeah, the quality alert system may not pick that up right away. That's a good point.
Well, the other funny part about all of this is, if you're a food manufacturer, you're generally not dealing with data sets that have sort of many thousands of data points for non-conformances that arise. So if you get 3 similar non-conformances in a row over the course of, say, a financial quarter, right? That could, if you look at statistical analysis and just the p-value and the likelihood that statisticians would say, yeah, that trend has got such statistical significance behind it that we're saying that clearly indicates some sort of inherent weakness that needs to be addressed, versus oh, honestly, you just fell prey to random chance there. No, you got unlucky 3 times in a row, and it doesn't indicate anything.
Yeah.
But by virtue of the fact that food manufacturers are working with small data sets, you can get so infatuated with a small sampling of similar types of non-conformance that arise that you completely take your eye off the ball. So maybe you've got a couple of microbiological fails that came up sequentially one after the other, and you think, well, that must mean we've got an emerging risk about microbiological hazards, and we must focus all of our attention there. Meanwhile, you've got allergens all over the place, completely uncontrolled, and you're not conscious of that risk because you're so focused on something that might not necessarily have any statistical significance to begin with.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think this ties in with the next thing that kind of brings us together for us is those critical thinking skills, right? Of being able to evaluate that. And it kind of gets back to, one of those definitions of intelligence, which is the ability to take, non-discrete type items that are not necessarily connected and finding the connections between those things and being able to root those out. So really, within plants, and what do you think? Generally within quality and food safety overall, those skills at actually thinking, those really aren't taught, are they?
Not, yeah, I'm going to say not at all, and it's not inherent to food manufacturing factories. But if you look at the educational system, you don't get critical thinking skills taught to you at any point. I suppose I'm a bit of an outlier because, among other things, I did A-level philosophy, so you kind of get reasonable at spotting logical fallacies. But it's hard to actually identify any point at which people would develop that sort of critical analysis. And if you'll excuse something of a, I'll have to ramble a little bit, but I think if I just describe the flaws that I think have crept in on root cause analysis approaches, it's sort of, it works in this way. So if we start off with 5 Whys, any trainer that will train somebody and say, this is how you carry out a 5 Whys analysis, says you keep on asking why, until you get to the root cause. Right? And it's the word the, which is inherently misleading, because it doesn't just imply, but it explicitly guides people to believe that there will be one root cause rather than numerous contributing factors that led to an incident occurring. But that's coupled with the glorification of identifying the root cause and practically shunning every proximate cause that was identified along the way. And I get frustrated because if you scale further and further back away from the original incident that occurred, and past numerous stages or layers of proximate causes until you eventually work your way back to a theoretical root cause, you're so far removed from what originally went wrong that potentially you might correct that underlying root cause and it would have absolutely no practical effect on the occurrence of the original incident. And what I didn't mention earlier, but if you take 5 Whys analysis back to its logical extreme in all cases, you always reach senior management commitment, because you can always say this would never have happened if we'd have only proactively resourced it better and made it a higher priority from the beginning and put more leadership and managerial commitment behind it. And that you can apply that universally. And the second thing that I think has sort of crept in on root cause analysis is, if you do fishbone diagrams, it's heavily reliant on 6M, which is man, method, machine, measurement, mother nature, and bracketed environment. I'm missing one off, but all of these factors are operations, practical, contributors, and it completely omits any consideration for the food safety and quality management system. So if you had an original incident that arose because of a systems deficiency in something like document control or traceability, and you did a standard fishbone diagram that's heavily reliant on 6M, there's actually no systematic or mechanistic capacity to work in the contributors that came from a failure of the food safety and quality management system, which is ironic, because if you look at any food safety and quality compliance standard, half of the point of doing root cause analyses is to identify deficiencies or weaknesses within the food safety and quality management system, and you would never get there if you followed a traditional fishbone based on 6M. So the reason, that's where the ramble sort of ends, and I'll say the applicability of that to the original point was, if you came in fresh and you just looked at the conventions that are at present, you might find yourself justified in saying, is anyone actually, are we doing this based on sound critical reasoning, or is this some sort of a very subtle joke at all of our individual professional expense?
Well, and to kind of reflect that back, it's kind of trying to use a mechanistic process for something that is meant to be wide ranging, and it locks you in too much. So, for example, we were talking about supplier hazard analysis earlier this week, and we have a standardized methodology how we do that. Here's your format, here's your template. All right, now we're going to look at these things from the standardized approach of high, medium, and low risk. And people will go, I'm going to say medium. It's like, oh, okay, why? Why is that medium? Well, I need to pick one of these three, and then I need to multiply it, and ta-da. Okay, then now what? Hey,
Well, the entire high, medium, low thing is born out of a risk matrix that looks at likelihood of occurrence and severity of outcome. And if you apply that in a HACCP context, it's it's got some use to it, right? Because if you look at high, medium, and low as a sort of traffic light signals, those of red, amber, green, on kind of how seriously we need to focus on each of these process steps. Right? If you're resource constrained, where should you put most of your attention? It's no bad thing to be able to say, we'll rank them out. We'll put them in some sort of hierarchical order, according to that kind of risk matrix outcome. But if you look at, say, a raw material risk assessment that encompasses allergenic, hazard, microbiological, foreign body, food fraud, right? And you say the ultimate outcome of this risk assessment was medium. And I say, all right, so now that we've identified a medium risk material, what sort of mitigating factors do we need to put into play? And you say, well, that depends actually on a variety of factors. I'm like, no. Don't need to hear any more in that case. Go back and do the risk assessment again. And whatever you were about to say, that's the output of the risk assessment, because the output of the risk assessment should inform mitigating actions or mitigating factors that can be put into play. And if your answer to everything is high, medium, or low, right, then and you say, well, we've got a high risk material, I'll say, well then, it's obvious. Put some high actions into place. It's nonsense that we've kind of just. And we need to address actually with a fresh pair of eyes, because the applicability of that approach can't be extended practically beyond a certain point.
right. Well, and I mean, the way I look at this too with this is, and just like you were in that example you were referencing, is like, well, this material is medium risk. Okay, that's a material. What about the supplier side of it? Is it if you have two buckets of this material, and one supplier is an excellent supplier and the other supplier is borderline, are they both still, even though they're both supplying that same raw material, are those both still medium? I would say no. And the way I think about this, Duncan, is instead of looking at this from a risk process associated with what we're talking about, it's more of a trust element. So for example, Nestle does this. If you're a new supplier shipping into a Nestle plant, they have a rigorous sampling program for your raw material at the plant side. If over time those results conform to specifications, they're going to back off on that testing schedule. But if you screw up, then again, you get bumped back up. So they're looking at you as a supplier from a risk standpoint for that material. It's that old saying, right? Trust but verify. So those things change over time too. The company changes ownership, market changes in the world. Say, for example, that there's a shortage of vanilla. Now, all of a sudden, that market has changed. But we never go back and reevaluate that assessment of risk, do we? We're just looking at this as a static box, and it's not.
At one point I was involved with a food manufacturer. They were buying different tree nuts from various sources. Most of the places where you're going to buy tree nuts, the factory that you're buying them from only produces that one type of tree nut, and they'll sell you it in various formats. So raw or roasted or chopped to different sizes, that kind of thing. But if say you were buying walnut pieces, most of the time it comes in and you've got an allergen exposure, just contains walnuts, doesn't have any adventitious risk from other allergens. And this food manufacturer had a spot purchase from a supplier that could provide you with any kind of a chopped up nut that you wanted, but they also handled peanuts on the same line. So this spot purchase was accompanied by adventitious contamination risk of peanut, right? Which is wholly unacceptable, right? And you kind of have this inbuilt sense that whenever you get the walnuts, you go, well, it's very, very clear and obvious right from the beginning that that there's going to be contains nuts. That's your allergen risk. But it's so easy to make a spot purchase from a different supplier and incur all sorts of other contaminants that you might not
Yeah.
necessarily anticipate. And on a point where you were talking about kind of you build up these long-standing relationships and build a risk profile for the suppliers that you're dealing with, I always think the first time that you make a purchase from a new supplier, that seems like the risk perception is at its peak,
Yeah.
and you're really eyeing them with a sense of suspicion. And from the supplier's point of view, that's when they know they're under scrutiny and they're on their best behaviour. I've seen
Yeah.
food manufacturers that are just embarking on new retail contracts, and you've got to submit samples from the beginning of the run, the middle, and the end of the production run to show consistency across a batch. And they're on the line, hand picking the samples out. And then after you've been dealing with a supplier for 12, 24 months, is that when complacency is setting in on the supplier side, just as the customer is thinking, well, we've got this long-standing history of perfect supply of safe, high-quality stuff, and we're going to we're going to reduce the sampling schedule.
Yeah.
Not as much risk perception there. And I'm wondering if we kind of addressing things in a way that seems sensible but can yield the opposite outcomes that we expect.
So Brina's been a good player. Welcome to the chat. A new face I haven't seen before. Welcome. So market. So this is a big problem. Is that if we're just looking at this risk and with the material itself, you need to go beyond that. If there's as she's mentioning here, a shortage of pistachios, that's going to change the market dynamics. One of the things I would always talk with when we were looking at a new supplier was there's a couple of key touch points for that new relationship. So R&D is now working on a new product, and they're doing some benchtop work, and everything looks good. And then they'll go to a plant trial, and it's looking great. To your point, Duncan, that supplier is on their best behavior at that point in time. And even if we say, okay, well, this is a critical ingredient for our processes. In the beginning, I want some pre-shipment samples in advance so that I can test it to make sure it's okay. Everybody goes, yeah, that's good. That's a good idea. That's really careful. That'll protect us. I'll throw the hand grenade in the room, which is then, how do we know that sample is actually reflective of what they're going to be sending us? How do we not know that is the pristine sample bag that they pull from on the shelf any time anyone wants a sample? Or is this an actual random sampling across that entire production run that is more representative of what we're actually getting? And of course, nobody can be sure, right? It comes back to that trust side of thing. Who are these people within your company? We'll keep on the pistachio example. So the plants need pistachios, and man, they're running out, and the production lines are going to get shut down. And the president of the company goes to procurement people, and what do, Duncan? They put the finger in the chest and they say, "You go out there and find pistachios. That's what I'm paying you for, procurement guy. Go get those pistachios." And they're like, "Yes, sir. That's their marching orders. Their job is to find them anywhere." Whoa, your risk in that just went up. You think that your pistachio risk is medium. It's not. It's now high, and you don't even recognize it.
Well, there's two things that come into play. So one's the system of incentives that's working on the purchasing person. And if their bonus is tied to purchase price and cost reduction versus other considerations like quality assurance and supplier approval processes, then you're kind of going to see that in the outcomes. And the other part of it is how instructions and requests are worded. So I used to do raw material approvals, and the requests that I received, and it didn't seem to make any difference to what food manufacturer I was working for, there was a common wording, which is, "Can you approve this?" It was never, "Can you assess this?" And the outcome is proposed in the original kind of request that comes to you. But if you're embarking on some sort of an approval process, it shouldn't be a foregone conclusion from the offset that you will actually approve, just in the same way that if the purchasing department is able to identify a potential new supplier, it shouldn't be a foregone conclusion that somebody's already drying the ink on a purchase order.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, and that's the element that always gets, thrown on us in quality for these assessments and evaluations, to your point, is, hey, can you approve this, Duncan? Oh, by the way, we need this for manufacturing in the plant on Friday. Right. So then
The first delivery is actually in a warehouse.
yeah, they throw you this hot potato, and now if the production lines get shut down, it's your fault. Really? Is it? Um, so that human side of it is very important on these raw materials. An example from my past is in a company I was working at. We were looking at launching coconut milk, and I didn't know anything about coconut milk. And we started looking at different suppliers, and of course, there was time rush to get this done. And we get the documentation from the different suppliers, and the leading candidate was a company in the Philippines. And so I had some questions on their documentation. So I got the president of the company on the phone and started hitting him with questions. And very shortly into the conversation, Duncan, he said, yeah, Bryan, I got to stop you. I'm like, yeah. He's like, I this documentation, this HACCP plan that you're going over, I don't really know anything about it. I'm like, well, tell me more. I know that to sell my product in the US, and you're a big customer and I want this business, I had to have this documentation. So I went to the local university, hired a student there, and they wrote this for me. Would you know that without actually taking the time to talk with that supplier? So we went directly to that location because now our risk had gone up significantly to visit that supplier and determine if they were acceptable or not. You have to dig below the surface. We would set up in past companies, which is a really good practice, by the way, for everybody, is for our key suppliers for volume or risk within Whitewave, we would set up quarterly meetings with those suppliers on a rotating schedule. And we would explain to them from a quality and a procurement standpoint, those metrics that we cared about, and we had a scorecard with that. And every single time, Duncan, when we would give them bad news saying, hey, from a quality side, we're not happy with you, that representative of that company was surprised. Why? Because they were the salesperson. They didn't know the details. They were there to manage the relationship. But it was an effective mechanism to get things changed because that quickly went up the chain of command within that supplier, because now we were unhappy and we were a big customer. So it was a very effective feedback mechanism.
Yeah, I'm just sort of interested on your anecdote there, because I think if you already know that the supplier you're dealing with is willing and opted into outsourcing writing their HACCP plan to a university student, if you go and do the audit and you find that on audit day everything looks good, you're still left with the knowledge that the management team thought that was a good idea, and extrapolating out, you kind of get an impression about how decisions are made.
Yeah. Did I trust them, and would I trust them in the future? No. But unfortunately, sometimes in fast moving food companies, I'm sure lots of people here can agree too, you have to compromise and you're forced into a position because it was like, that's all we had, right? We didn't have any good options at that point in time. Were we looking at other options? Yes. But as we know, launch dates are set by retailers, not the food companies. So if there's a shelf reset in September for Target here in the US or Sainsbury's or whoever, that's what they work backwards from, because they want to get the product on shelf at that point in time. And then they ramrod everything into that process, which produces more risk for that supplier relationship. Because back to our earlier points, they want the business. We need them because we don't have a whole lot of options at that point in time. That human side, again, high, medium, low, doesn't cover that, right? And you need to understand and develop that skill set. And as Bonna had said earlier as well, too, that's what we call experience. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, just completely agree with all of that. I was working with a heavily R&D biased company at one point, and you could go into the development kitchen on any day, and they were preparing samples to take into retailers. And I think they had something of an advantage that the spectrum of retailers that they were dealing with was fairly broad, and all of the product launch cycles, some of it was seasonal, some of it was non-seasonal. And you find that under those circumstances, you kind of spreading your prospects into enough baskets where there's always time pressure, but you're not wholly dependent on any particular one of them, but if it's a different situation and you're a small food manufacturer with a smaller customer base and it's a seasonal product launch and the retailers are waiting until the last minute for a good reason, actually, because imagine you sort of take yourself out of the food manufacturer perspective and instead you're now in a retailer perspective. You need to wait until consumer preference trends emerge in buying data before you can give an MPD brief for an upcoming seasonal launch. Yeah. So if it was Easter and you're looking at a fancy type of new Easter egg, you kind of don't know in advance if it should be heavily sort of caramel or white chocolate or with sort of pistachio bits all over it until buying patterns across consumers become apparent. And that's not going to happen sort of years in advance. No. So even if you're in a relatively shelf-stable, sort of low-risk ambient category, you find that your launch cycles are still, really, really constricted. And it doesn't make any sense until you realize that the time constraint comes from consumer preference data, which by definition can't be available until shortly before the seasonal launch.
Yeah, well, and to build on that as well too is that public and political / regulatory environment. So of course, here in the US, there's a lot of activity going around for product reformulation, removing artificial colors, all of these type of activities. The public is very aware of this. There's a lot of talk about it in the media, and customers are demanding it, and therefore manufacturers are scrambling to reformulate their products and making public commitments to do that. And that puts tremendous pressure on those suppliers of natural colors and flavors, et cetera, et cetera. Now, all of these food companies are scrambling with these R&D or flavor companies to try and develop new formulations that the public's going to like. That increases risk because everybody is trying to allocate the same resources at the same time, and that's not going to fly. But with that, I wanted to save enough time here as well, Duncan, is AI. So you're very involved with AI, and we had some very good conversations earlier with this week. So it's very tempting, and this gets into our thinking piece of the conversation here. It's very tempting to say, well, I don't have a whole lot of time to do a lot of evaluation and looking at the coconut milk from the Philippines or whatever. I'm going to start using AI to do a lot of the legwork for me. So number one, I kind of wanted to go over your thoughts around AI, some of the tips and tricks that you're using, because a lot of times now this is kind of assumed, and people's different knowledge levels with this varies. And sometimes you feel behind the curve. So if we had any tips and tricks and things that you've learned or tools out there that you really, really like, I think this is kind of a good segue into that conversation. So for AI, what type of tools do you use? For me, I like Grok. I love using Grok. That's my favorite.
So first interesting point on that is if you look at ChatGPT, Gemini, Claude from Anthropic, Grok, and when they're doing benchmarking to compare the capabilities of these different models against each other, there's very, very little to differentiate them. So if you look at things like creative writing style, or human interaction or chat interaction, or image generation, or logic or coding ability, when you look at the comparison charts, there's normally about a 1 or 2% differentiation between the different models. And it's kind of the opposite of what you'd expect, because you'd think in a new emerging field such as AI, the research and development for the different models would kind of naturally diverge across into different capabilities, and you'd see sort of more pronounced strengths and weaknesses across the different models. But as it actually is, every time a new model is upgraded by any provider, you see the different kind of the comparison charts, and there's next to nothing that differentiates them. And I think based on everything I've been seeing, the the explanation for that appears to be that research or the actual innovative development of the AI models has been ongoing for many years, but not made public. And when ChatGPT came out, with OpenAI launched ChatGPT, it kind of disrupted the market, and they took first mover advantage. And then everybody else, like Anthropic and X and everybody who had similar models in development, kind of forced their hand, and they had to kind of launch their offerings. But the actual underlying development of the models was sort of following similar paths across the board. And I think, when I'm looking at X with Grok, I think that their main point of differentiation is the tone. So, when you look at the output, it's sassy. All right. And when Elon Musk's talking about it, he goes on about how he's anti-woke, and he has a strong sort of fact and truth bias, which you can think, hold whatever opinion you want about that, but I've seen video clips of it coming out with some pretty sketchy sort of outputs where you kind of go, look, if you're not an overt racist, you just don't want that sort of thing. But the main differentiator I see on Grok is it's got a sassy tone. But when you look at the actual content and if we say the substance of what the output contains, there's nothing to differentiate them. So I wouldn't get particularly married to any one model in preference to any of the others. I find OpenAI's ChatGPT is pretty good. I mean, when they updated it to GPT-5, there was a little bit of a wobble and a bit of pushback. And up until that point, you might say Claude Anthropic was better at more natural human-sounding output. In reality, it's a bit of an arms race where every time one model becomes reputed for being stronger than the others in any particular area, it's only a matter of weeks before you see the others upgrade to respond. So I think it's something of a fallacy to think any one model is significantly better or differentiated than the others.
Okay, good. So in other words, use what you like. I mean, really, because part of this then too is they're essentially all pulling from the same information. And at this point in time, AI is unable to extrapolate, which kind of gets back to our conversation around the thinking side. It's not going to replace thinking. It's pulling from what's already out there and then doing its thing. So that piece of how we interact with it and what we use that for is the critical piece. So only think of this as a tool to look at lots of stuff so that you can kind of distill it down and then use that for your evaluation process. So do you have any tips for people out there on learning about AI and how to effectively use it and what not to do? And any tips out there for people?
Yeah, totally. So the first thing is there was a big wave of people talking about how they're prompt engineers and AI experts. They say sort of prompt engineering and stuff, and that was kind of I sort of sneer and roll my eyes a little bit, because these people that were calling themselves AI experts, I'm saying, nobody's an AI expert. This has been this is an emerging field that's knocked around for a matter of years. If you think that you need to be in the game for 10 to 15 years for any existing field before you're an expert, it's a bit early days for that title. But when I'm sort of slightly disparaging now of prompt engineer, the reason for that is it's actually better not to get fixated on producing the most granular or prescriptive prompts. You don't want to be in a position where you've written 2 A4 pages of prompts that you think is going to yield a magical output. And it's much better to treat the AI almost as if it's treat it a little bit as if it's a human and literally chat with it. So you say, look, here's what I'm trying to get to. And so the objective I'm working toward is this kind of thing. Maybe I've got some examples to show you. This type of thing. Are we on board? And it will say, yeah, got it. I understand. Then you can kind of say, but the constraint that I'm working with is this. So the nature of the problem that I need to overcome is this. Kind of can you kind of give me any suggestions on how to move forward effectively? And a lot of the time, if you treat this in a discussion format rather than trying to engineer some sort of a super prompt, you'll be able to gain a better outcome, because that kind of chat back and forth interaction is going to yield a memory on the AI where it'll understand your objective, it'll understand your constraints that you told it, it's going to understand the process that you're trying to get to, it'll offer you suggestions and you can kind of guide the process, and you'll end up with a history where that will be far more effective, far by wide margin, no contest, far better than trying to sit down and engineer a prompt. So
that makes sense. Yeah, so it's kind of like what Ryan is saying here. He had a quick question here. Is so using AI for cross-checking for accuracy. What do you think of that?
All the time. So what I'll do sometimes is I'll tell it what I want to achieve and get an output. And then I'll take that same output, put it back in, and I'll say to it, criticize this. Assume that there's some sort of a defect and find it. Identify any opportunities for improvement. Tell me any way that this could be expanded upon. Is there anything that you would expect to find in here that seems to be missing? Right. And if you go through those sorts of, I'm going to have to say prompt here, but if you use that type of interactive approach where it's giving you the output and then you literally feed it back in and you say, this is what we got to, and I want you to criticize it in a targeted way, then you can use it for that purpose.
Okay,
and
excellent.
Sometimes I'll use different models to fact check or evaluate the output from one using another.
Excellent. So we're short on time here, so let's kind of summarize this. We've covered a ton of territory here, Duncan. What with our two main topics here, then relative to our corrective actions and thinking and processes and potential using AI for these, what would you like to leave people with here today?
Think never be afraid of challenging with a new set of eyes certain conventions that we all seem to be operating under. So just because it's the conventional approach doesn't mean that we're rigidly confined to follow it. We don't want to operate like trains on train tracks, navigating lots of different problems over the same route. We want to be more like car drivers and actually take the steering wheel. And it's also dangerous to look at mechanisms or problem-solving approaches that seem to be ubiquitous across the industry and convince ourselves that that's the best or only approach to doing things. Because we've got this term, industry best practice, as if doing anything else is some sort of heresy. But if we're going to evolve and progress what industry best practice means, inherently we have to challenge it. So just always use a bit of critical thinking, and it's quite helpful to start off with the assumption that whatever you're presented with or whatever conventions at play is only a starting point. That assume that there's some way of improving on things.
Yeah, no, that's a good way to phrase it. And I think that's a good way to wrap it up. What we're talking about here is so I use the phrase, if you hear this in a plant or at corporate, we've always done it this way, right? That's always a warning sign that something needs to be looked at. Well, that applies to us too, right? So if we say, well, these are the tools that we always use, well, that's probably not the right approach either. So as I promised, guys, I'm putting in here. And thank you, Duncan, for this as well at Food Industry Hub. As we mentioned earlier, his template for raw materials, I'm putting the link in there for that. spend some time on his site. There is a ton of information there. Thank you, Duncan. I mean, you're a great resource of all the work that you do out there. I would also be remiss if I didn't. Yeah, absolutely. And I also wanted to make sure and announce as well too. I've partnered with Culture Advisory Group, which is a Canadian company and a well-known person within our industry here in the U.S. and Canada is a gentleman named Paul Valder. And he's the CEO over there. And him and I have worked together for a number of years. And we're teaming up on risk assessment and doing some amazing things on that. So earlier this week, the webinar and these type of activities, and we're just getting an amazing response on this. And I think our chat today kind of is a window into that as well, in that we can't be rigid. We can't look at high, medium, and low. We need to look at more factors when we're looking at this stuff. So that's very important. And thank you, Duncan, for the perspective you bring on this, which is fantastic. And thank you, everybody, for attending another fascinating food safety chat with tons of information. I know I pulled a ton out that I need to look at over this weekend and start applying in what I do as well. So with that, we're going to bring our chat to a close here today. Thank you, Duncan, again for attending. And thank you, everybody. And we'll see you back here next week. In the meantime, enjoy your weekend. Have a great time. But we will be back here on Friday at 8 a.m. Mountain Time, 10 a.m. Eastern, where I will bring another fascinating guest like Duncan onto the chat to have a conversation with you. So we'll see you then. Have a good one, everybody.
Have a wonderful weekend.